Hello, everyone, and a very warm welcome indeed to our seminar today on Irish post-colonial studies, legacies and agendas. I'm Emer Nolan from the English department at Maynooth University, and my colleague Michael Cronin is also here somewhere to help me with chairing this session. Our thanks again are due to Lauren Arrington, our head of department, and also to Tracy O'Flaherty for her help with organising the series. This is the third in a series of Irish Studies seminars this semester. You can find details of these and of our other events on our departmental webpage and YouTube channel. We're delighted to be joined by 5 panelists today: Treasa de Loughry, David Lloyd, Caoilfhionn Bheacháin, Lionel Pilkington and Malcolm Sen. And I'll introduce each of the contributors individually as we come to them in alphabetical order. Each will begin by making a short contribution of 10 or 15 minutes or so. We'll then open matters up for questions and debate. We've also invited our panelists from our previous session on modernism to return for this conversation. So I'm delighted to say that we'll be joined again during the discussion period by Enda Duffy and Joe Cleary. Our topic today is post-colonial studies, legacies and agendas. And I'll just say a few words about the topic and our rationale for selecting it. It seems relatively straightforward to date the advent of post-colonial studies in Ireland to the 1980s, to Field Day and to several other critical initiatives, publications and conferences that we will, I'm sure, have occasion to mention later today. This coincided with a new turn to critical theory in cultural studies internationally and in Ireland. It also coincided with continuing crisis in the north and economic recession and social conflict in the Republic of Ireland. I obviously won't attempt to sketch the entire history of the field here. Others may take up some of these themes later. But from the inception of post-colonial studies, critics and commentators sought to examine the dilemmas consequent on partition and of post-colonial economic development in comparative perspective, with a then fairly new and still controversial stress on the psychological and the cultural aftermath of Ireland's colonial history, especially in the 19th century, and also on the powerful forces that seek to obliterate the memory of such long-term damage. It's maybe somewhat harder to say if or when post-colonial studies ended, or as some might put it, should have ended. Perhaps it mutated or was incorporated into something else. Maybe after the Good Friday Agreement, the Celtic Tiger boom, the eclipse of emigration by inward migration into Ireland. However, it's not always so easy to tell the difference between those announcing the demise of post-colonial critique in Irish studies and those many commentators in the academic world and beyond it who declared it was misguided from the outset. The criticisms have been various. Post-colonial studies was too Marxist, too disrespectful of the autonomy of art, or alternatively too culturalist or too focused on nationalist sentiment, not nearly Marxist enough. But what any intellectual history would almost certainly show is that post-colonial studies was institutionally resisted and not from any single quarter. And in our own view, some Irish-based criticisms were in fact devoted to protecting the established structures, academic as well as political, in North and South, and bitterly resistant to any far-reaching critique of them. 2 decades after the Good Friday Agreement, after the crash, austerity, and the midst of the current crisis, what does the political economic landscape look like? The general election of February 2020, just weeks before COVID struck, gave an index of the mood of young Irish voters in particular. There seemed to be a shift away from the traditional parties, but perhaps not a shift away from a post-colonial cast of mind as such. Sinn Féin, after all, was the beneficiary of this shift. Perhaps we are looking at a reinterpretation of the post-colonial. We're also beginning to see the long-predicted consequences of Brexit in the north and the revival of the question of the union in Britain more generally. Irish people of different classes and denominations were obviously involved in the British Empire in various ways. Yet no modern Irish state had colonies or was an imperialist superpower in the UK or US manner. The Irish Free State, later Republic, came into existence not on the basis of slavery or genocidal extermination, but as part of an extended anti-imperialist struggle for self-determination. How significant can this be for future politics, especially now that Ireland, along with other EU states, is a fully paid up member of Fortress Europe? In the context of the ongoing Black Lives Matter and other anti-racist movements in Europe and the US, does it make any sense to think of Ireland, as Emma de Beery, for example, has recently suggested, as one of the places where thinking about migration and race might evolve in alternative ways to the racial politics of the UK or the US? Further, Irish post-colonial studies was generally deeply influenced by a Frankfurt School critique of capitalism, a strand of critique that was always attentive to the false promises of consumerism. By now, this insight has evolved into the recognition that the system has brought the planet to a condition of ecological crisis. Now, when the house is on fire, what value has the humanities other than outlining or lamenting a collective tragedy? Can the humanities offer a civilizational alternative to the world of capital? Meanwhile, the pandemic is perhaps the tragic opportunity for us all to consider what we have called normality in Irish studies and beyond, and what has subtended it. These are big questions, but nesting within that larger framework, we might also address other ones. What changes have post-colonial studies affected in disciplinary terms in Irish literary or historical studies, the disciplines where it has always been most contested? In what ways have post-colonial studies changed how we think about Irish writing or how we understand Irish literary history? Does the recent uptake of questions of empire and race in British and Irish universities, these often mediated now by historians rather than by literary critics like Edward Said or Gayatri Spivak, suggest not so much the death as the return of post-colonial studies? Since its inception, we would argue that post-colonial studies has mattered in Ireland, both on a national level in its capacity to at times shape public discourse, and institutionally in the intellectual agendas and the projects academics and teachers set ourselves. So it is our hope that without conflating these different kinds of questions, we can address the past, the present, and the future of post-colonial studies in these intersecting contexts. A warm welcome to our first panelist, Treasa de Loughry, who lectures in world literature in the School of English, Drama and Film at University College Dublin. Treasa's main research interests lie in the study of environmental humanities in world and post-colonial literature, especially issues of energy, waste, pollution, and food. She's the author of the newly published The Global Novel and Capitalism in Crisis, Contemporary Literary Narratives, and she is now also at work on a second book, which will focus on cultural registrations of waste work in West Africa and South and East Asia. Treasa, you're very welcome.
Great, thanks Emer, and thanks Tracy for helping to set this up. I'm the first to admit that I'm an odd choice for this seminar today, given that my work has generally been on the global novel. I'm thinking about broader transformations in world literature and the environmental humanities, and my work is focused a lot on South Asian authors, contemporary British and US authors especially. And in our email correspondence, Emer asked me to consider why I thought there weren't many new Irish post-colonialists, what impact this might have in the field, if I thought there's any precedent for Marxist-influenced Irish cultural studies, whether I feel my generation started afresh and why, and would I perhaps wish to offer a critique of earlier Irish criticism from that point of view. So I'll deal with several of these questions in different ways, not all of them, and I'll zoom in and out from questions of the field as I construe them from my perspective and working on it, very contemporary post-colonial and materialist world literary framework, to thinking about wider institutional conditions and then back again. So I'm going to keep things pretty broad and perhaps a bit sociological for today. Just to say as well, my own investment in Irish literature is in contemporary Irish fiction. I'm interested in how it relates to the environment, pollution and toxicity, but also within a comparative world systemic frame. I'm interested in how Ireland's semi-peripheral status in the capitalist world system gets registered in fiction. And I have a long durée and more dilettantish interest in Irish fiction and the Irish language as well, having kind of gone to like Irish schools in my youth, so on. My family's from the west of Ireland, so I'm kind of deeply invested in these questions, but kind of in a very roundabout way. So to start, in 2020, John Brannigan described in the Golden Jubilee issue of the Irish University Review how during his tenure as editor of the journal, articles and writers like Joyce, Beckett and Heaney came dripping in ever slow, as Yeats might put it, but steadily, while work on women writers, let alone those from marginal communities or conceptual analysis of the field, were more rare. Brannigan's observations align with some of what I glimpsed attending the occasional Irish Studies conference and being based in Ireland, specifically UCD for the entirety of my research. There is no shortage of single author PhD topics, especially those focused on Irish modernism. Only gradually, it seemed to me, was there a sea change occurring with projects focused on forgotten voices by returning to the archives, or with an increase in more comparative post-colonial analysis. But even the latter tended sometimes to obvious aestheticized choices, the nation language of Caribbean poet Camus Brathwaite, a hinge into discussing the Irish revival, or the polyphonic ambition of James Joyce's Ulysses, the default way for a time into discussions of Salman Rushdie's 1981 novel Midnight's Children. And there's obviously a lot to unpack here, drawing on Timothy Brennan's work on Rushdie. We could approach this firstly as the outcome of the co-production of Irish literature with post-colonial literary studies. And I'm being a bit speculative here, and I'm paraphrasing Neil Lazarus's point in his 2011 book, The Post-Colonial Unconscious, that the post-colonial literary studies of the 1980s and onwards were at times overly concerned with modernist texts, which reconfirmed post-structuralist readings of literary style. So in particular, he singles out Midnight's Children, to the neglect of more realist or generically hybrid texts and modes, framed as these texts were by a North American and European metropolitan suspicion and literary criticism towards anti-colonial socialist movements or realist literary modes. We might reconsider then perhaps how focus on Irish modernism, how it relates to post-colonial fiction, risked overshadowing realist or uneven literary works or unregarded authors that don't fit neatly within tales of international canonization, but yet participated in a local and global republic of letters or global networks of class solidarity. And I know that a few of our speakers today have certainly worked in those kind of drawing out those veins of international kind of global solidarity and different class registrations in the fiction of that time. While it's now commonplace to state that the Irish Revolution in European terms was the most right-wing revolutionary movement in Europe, which gestures to comparative and complex recognition of stalled social progress alongside the success of achieving sovereignty, this wasn't the case for a long time, even up until the beginning of the decade of commemoration, which occurred in tandem with the marriage equality and repeal referenda. And the point I'm making is that it would be easy to argue that broader generational and political shifts are accelerating changes in literary research and in the kind of comparative analysis that people are willing to make more readily. But it feels uncomfortable to discuss this literary history without considering broader conditions of precarity. So turning from the what and identifying omissions in literary research to the why. And I think this question has resounding salience now. Anne Mulhall's contribution on whiteness, academia and activism in the same issue of the IUR asks whether Irish studies itself now needs to be decolonised, but concludes that as it is currently constituted in its whiteness, its conservatism, its elitist and hierarchical attachments, it is quite possible that the field of Irish studies does not appear particularly hospitable or relevant to present and future BAME critics, thinkers, researchers and writers, most particularly people living and working in Ireland. An argument that we can't divorce from the lack of stable employment and funding streams in Ireland for those BAME and marginal communities that might offer a different perspective on Irish literary studies. And I'm not saying something as simplistic as that we need to remove Joyce from curricula or anything like that, but rather that the discussion of diversity in our teaching and research goes hand in hand with wider structural conditions. The underfunding of humanities research while global is felt especially strongly here in our smaller academic environment. Our university system now has, in the short space of 10 years since the financial crash, a reliance on private income streams comparable in Europe only to the UK. Yesterday, the European University Association's Public Funding Observatory report, that's a mouthful, into higher education systems over the past decade was published and reported on in the Irish Times if you want to read more. And it describes Ireland's austerity approach to the university sector, despite strong student growth, as an extreme case comparable to Serbia and Lithuania. That we are compared to what are regarded as Europe's peripheral states, who are similarly vulnerable to global financial busts, is here significant. And it's only now that Ireland is returning to a similar level of funding to 2008, despite an increase of student numbers by 37%. So we have a similar number of academic staff and there's a decline in administrative staff. Comparative work necessitates well-funded research travel fellowships, better institutional efforts to consolidate international research, co-supervision across borders, say, or well-funded scholarships that could transform academic research. It's hard to read essays in the same issue of the IUR by Anne Mulhall, Emma Penny and Deirdre Flynn about the lack of diversity in Irish academia without then considering that an apparent absence of ambitious conceptual publications might have roots in the lack of generous funding and economic certainty that this work requires, and that this links also to the lack of employment opportunities afterwards. And I am aware that there's a difference between what John Brannigan, as the former editor of the IUR, and what Emily Pine, as the current editor, both identify as gaps in articles received and actually existing research, but we have to work with the data that's available. So the gaps that they perceive are around low levels of essays published on women writers and pre-1900 literatures, or from other parts of the world, or indeed texts that take comparative analysis. I don't need to mind my own experiences here. The difficulty of funding postdoctoral world literary research in Ireland meant that I sought employment in the UK. But consider, for instance, that Deirdre Flynn's essay on being precarious in the same issue, which details her hours of paid and unpaid academic work across multiple institutions while being unable to afford rent several years on from her PhD, is a rather typical story. The lessons of the 2016 Cush report that atypical part-time employment is now a significant phenomenon in third-level institutions in Ireland barely need to be stating even now 5 years on from the publication of the report. And I think it would be useful to carry this discussion over into our Q&A later, given the particular impact that labour conditions have on decolonising discussions. So, as Emer mentioned earlier, so we're at the point where without structural university support in relation to recruitment, research funding and infrastructure, any effort to diversify teaching will mean, diversifying scare quotes, will mean a reliance on ever more precarious labour, which would create greater asymmetries, further compounded by racial and class inequalities. So paying attention to the specificity of the structural conditions of austerity in Ireland as a semi-peripheral nation state within that bigger European project, and the implications that it has then our teaching and research and how it is that we approach these questions of what it means to do post-colonial literature and research within this context, I think is very significant. In any case, that recent discussions have refocused on Ireland's own complicity in the imperial project and role in facilitating multinational capital in the present further suggests a mismatch perhaps between post-colonial theory and actually existing conditions in ways that have ramifications for literary analysis. In the late 2000s, I couldn't theorise this sense that the received protocols of Irish literary studies did not reflect the world that I knew, that Irish literature in English and Gaelic was always elegiac, high modernist, or framed by questions around partition. And it couldn't explain a post-colonial, to use a tired phrase, experience of Ireland's internally differentiated divisions, that despite the nation's dizzying economic advancement under Bertie Ahern's Fianna Fáil government, Ireland was still Europe's semi-periphery, riven by the contradictions of capitalist modernity and multiple overlapping social, legal and environmental anachronisms which produced a dizzying set of incongruities. Ireland is unique, Dennis O'Hearn argues in a 2016 interview for the Journal of World Systems Research, in the degree of the dualism of its economy, the domination of transnational capital, manufacturing and some services on the one hand, and traditional agriculture on the other. You don't have to read Trotsky on uneven and combined development to intimate that these extreme dualisms extend beyond the economic to include the extremities of our life worlds, the role of the church, for example, in the Irish state, alongside the kind of high modernist aesthetic experimentation. These are dizzying kind of incongruities to hold in your head at once for a nation state to contain. And this is a world away, it would seem to me, from discourses that position Ireland as the victim of imperial modernity. Relatedly, a materialist direction in world literary studies has sought to understand how an asymmetrical and extractive world economic system composed of cores, peripheries and semi-peripheries might have a correlative rather than causal relationship with the world of literature, as Joe Cleary discussed in the first seminar drawing on Pascal Casanova and Franco Moretti. Such theories offered a framework within which I could explore the ongoing existence of global and regional socioeconomic inequalities and extractive regimes that exceed the temporal marker of the post-colonial, and could perhaps account for Ireland's complex role in a US-dominated world system and as an unevenly developed European semi-periphery. In their 2015 book on Combined and Uneven Development, the Warwick Research Collective described this as a concern with the literary registration and encoding of modernity as a social logic, or a tripartite conceptualization of a modern world system, modernity, world literature, in terms of which the latter is understood as, in the broadest sense, as the literature of the modern capitalist world system as emerging in the 15th century. So I see this as a diachronic and synchronic method that I won't go into now. And in 2012, Michael Niblett further argued for a reading of the environmental dimensions of the world system, as in Jason W. Moore's terms, a world ecological one, given that capitalism doesn't just work on, but is fueled by nature's cheap resources and raw materials, and may eventually find its ecological limit in a world of intense resource scarcity and climate change weathers. And Niblett goes on to theorize that culture may itself be considered an ecological force in terms of its impact on environment making, in terms of the impact of environmental genres and different modes of narrative, for example. It seems obvious to me, looking from without, thinking in a world literary perspective, that Irish literary studies must always be global and ecological, given its role in an expanded history of capitalist modernity as the laboratory for Tudor-era plantations through to laissez-faire 19th century famine policies, which found expression in British colonial projects in the Caribbean and India. And there's lots we could say about how the environment was compartmentalized out of Irish literary studies too, in terms of generic discontinuities, in terms of the ideological role of the Free State in emphasizing modernization and consistently underplaying the environment, and in terms of the colonial imaginary and apprehension of the environment too, that kind of sees it as an externality to be bracketed out of society and kind of tamed and transformed and extracted in new ways. And narrating Ireland's role in global histories and cultures of extraction as the timber plantation breadbasket and recruiting ground of empire would seem more important now than ever, given Ireland's contemporary role as the site for global financial capitalism and new frontiers in energy-hungry digital infrastructures, as these go hand in hand with broader trends in automation and deepening fuel poverty and in pollution, and become registered in increasingly speculative and dystopian work by authors like Mike McCormack, Oisin Fagan and Deirdre Sullivan, and as is excavated in eco-critical research by scholars like Lucy Collins, Trey Deckard, Patrick Bresenhen and Malcolm Sen, amongst others. I'm going to stop there because Malcolm, I think, will speak more about this in a minute, so I don't want to go on too much longer about it, and I'll finish there. Thanks, Emer.
Many thanks, Treasa, and I'm certain that many of those themes you've introduced will be explored more fully later. But in the meantime, we'll move along, and our next speaker is David Lloyd, who is Distinguished Professor of English at the University of California at Riverside. The appearance of David's book, Nationalism and Minor Literature, James Clarence Mangan and the Emergence of Irish Cultural Nationalism in 1992, marked a crucial moment in the development of post-colonialism in the field of Irish literature. His works since have included the books Ireland After History, Irish Culture and Colonial Modernity, Beckett's Thing, Theatre and Painting, and from 2018, Underrepresentation, The Racial Regime of Aesthetics. He's currently writing a book about law, poetry, and violence.
Thank you, Emer, and thanks to you for the invitation to come, and also to everybody for being on the panel. And I also want to thank the members of the panel on modernism who've returned, because in many ways what I'm going to be trying to talk about today picks up on some of that discussion, which I found extremely stimulating and interesting, and I regretted not having been able to actually be there at the session. Emer mentioned a book I'm writing on poetry and violence, but before I come to that, I'm actually finishing a collection of essays on Irish poetry, focusing on what are known mostly as, in various parlance, Irish experimentalists, Irish innovative poets, Irish modernists, late modernists, neo-avant-gardists, and so forth. I'm referring, of course, to poets like Catherine Walsh, Maurice Scully, Trevor Joyce, and others who've become loosely known as the Sandai poets. And trying to sort through this mishmash of terminology being applied, none of which ever seems quite to fit, I found myself going down a kind of rabbit hole that I can only hope will turn out to be a wormhole of trying to understand the phenomena that this terminological uncertainty points towards, that many have noted, which is that Ireland went through a remarkable period of modernist literary production and other forms of artistic production, and then turned to a remarkable anti-modernist reaction. I'm interested in the phenomenon that various commentators have remarked on, from Terence Brown to Desmond Bell, that and Alex Davis, of course, writing on the poets, that Ireland lacked an avant-garde. And that in general, the thrust of Irish modernism receded, leaving the fish, as Yeats said, gasping on the shore. And I've been very influenced here, first of all, by Joe Cleary's great essay in Outrageous Fortune, the essay on capital and culture, and also by two books that came out in the kind of wake of what I would think of as the first surge of Irish post-colonial criticism, that I went back to trying to understand the history of Irish criticism and the history of Irish anti-modernism. One of them is Jerry Smith's brilliant book, Decolonization and Criticism, and the other is your own Conor McCarthy's great book, Modernization. So I want to acknowledge that debt, and also to signal that these books were, in a certain sense, ways in which the advent of post-colonial criticism and its focus on Irish modernism played out into other spheres that had to do, in Jerry Smith's case, with the 1950s, in Conor McCarthy's case, with the post-1960s modernization of Ireland. And in following that line, I wanted to think through, in completing this book, what post-colonial theory and post-colonial projects might have to actually say about the rationales for Ireland's turn into a kind of anti-modernism that remains very, very powerfully with us. When I think about the general state of Irish poetry, I'm constantly astonished by its conservatism, both formally and also thematically, and by its deep hostility that I think was mentioned by Emer even at the very not only to formal experiment, but also to thought. There's a deep anti-intellectualism. I'll restrict myself to Irish poetry criticism in order not to tread on too many corns, but I think a deep anti-intellectualism that is involved here too, almost as though the wake of the Irish colonial upsurge and insurgence was in fact a kind of traumatized, I think Seamus Dean has called it, our post-colonial concussion, and that Adorno refers to as a snail retracting its horns from the unpleasant until it becomes habitual. But there are a couple of things I want to say about modernism and the colonial context that I think post-colonial critique has helped us to understand. The first is, certainly, as Joe was arguing last time these panels were convened, modernism has to be understood within a larger world literary system. Another way to think about modernism, however, is the way in which I think Peter Berger understands it in his book Theory of the Avant-Garde, which is not to see modernism as a discontinuity and a break with romanticism, with realism, with symbolism, but rather as the most extreme assertion of the autonomy of art, which of course really was posited for the first time around the 1790s in aesthetic theory, and then pushed through the work of artists in the 19th century. Modernism is not a break with that assertion, but its most extreme manifestation. And so when we think about what happens, and I'm following Berger here, within modernism, there is on the one hand a vigorous assertion of art for art's sake, which of course we find manifested both in Yeats in peculiar ways and in Joyce in other ways, but which goes hand in hand contradictorily with an increasing institutionalization of art. Berger then argues that the input of the avant-garde, which should not be confused with international modernism, is to try to break those institutions, to antagonize those institutions, and to engage in what Berger calls the dissolution of the division between art and life praxis. And so the effort of the avant-garde is to try to reconnect with social movements and with revolutionary politics by precisely assaulting the places in which art has been institutionalized. If we turn then to Irish modernism, we have to realize that Irish modernism has a peculiar place within the world literary system, which I heard Joe last time talking about in terms of London and Paris and eventually New York. Irish modernism emerges not as an assertion of the autonomy of art, something which greatly vexed Yeats in his early writings on poetry and nationalism, but rather as the expression of nationalism's needs for parastate institutions that could take the place of the state institutions that nationalism had not yet captured, and which were needed in order to organize the people. As Yeats puts it, the point of his work, in his early work, was to organize the desire of the people and to turn it towards the nation. This correlation of Irish modernism with the building of non-state institutions is an extremely important part of our understanding of modernism, because far from expressing the autonomy of art in its extreme form, the revival artists embrace, in fact, an institutionalization within insurgent institutions and not in the academic and the museum-style institutions at which Berger is aiming in his theory of the avant-garde, and which are characteristic of metropolitan cultures. What then do we do with the reaction against Irish modernism? Because it is not clearly, there is no space for a serious avant-garde to challenge a modernism that has actually itself been part of insurgent movements, part of a life praxis. And so I think we need to understand the turn against modernism in a kind of double frame. First of all, a post-independence culture in which it's quite striking, as Nicholas Allen has shown, along with others like Mark Quigley, that in the wake of independence, the remaining intellectuals of left republicanism were the ones who became the critical artists. In doing so, as far as I can see, their anti-nationalism that developed out of their left republicanism in the face of the kind of nationalism that was put in place, the isolationism, the conservatism, and so forth, by the Free State, conjoins with a reaction against modernism. The reaction against nationalism, as I'm beginning to see it, takes the form of an assertion of a kind of weak universalism. I'm not sure that that's a particularly philosophical phrase. It is the way I have to see it. A weak universalism that expresses it as, for example, in Caoilfhionn, as a desire to represent the common man, whether in the pub or the marketplace, which, after all, is not that different from what Daniel Corkery said about finding the Irish represented on the racecourse. The point being that what the anti-modernism stands for in relation to this anti-nationalism is a kind of transcendence of the gap between art and life praxis, which takes not an avant-garde and innovative form, but rather a reactionary form which finds in the naturalism that Joe Cleary has identified as a major feature, not only of the prose, but of the poetry from the 1930s through into the 1960s. But actually, it takes the weak form of an assertion of the anti-artistic, the plain man version of literary style and literary communication. The most tragic examples of that in Irish literary history of the period seem to me to be Patrick Kavanagh on the one hand, whose early modernist efforts in The Great Hunger lapse with appalling rapidity into the rather inept ballads that he produces in his later career, and Flann O'Brien, who appears to be shocked by his own innovativeness in At Swim Two Birds and The Third Policeman, and quite literally turns the critique of the artist against his own writing, which he destroys in works like the Dalkey Archive later in his life, in which you may recall James Joyce is a barback washing glasses in a bar in Dalkey, fulminating against the team of pornographers who have destroyed his beautiful work and produced a travesty of it. That's not an insignificant point. Beckett remarks in his essay on censorship, a passing essay, that at the core of censorship, which of course was one of the principal things that the Bell and artists like Caoilfhionn were contesting in Ireland at the time, the Bell was contesting censorship, but Beckett points out that the censorship regime was actually constantly being cast as the expression of a certain kind of common sense of the plain man. It converges, in other words, with the aesthetic that is being promoted by Irish anti-modernism. Let me turn to what I see happening, and I'm indebted here to Jerry Smith's work, but unfortunately, we currently lack, to my best of my knowledge, a history of the emergence of Irish academic criticism. But it seems to me that as Jerry Smith shows, Irish literary critics in the academic sphere come very belatedly to the discovery of Irish modernism as a major set of industries within the larger Anglophone world's critical industry. And what occurs is an adoption, almost wholesale, that is the academic version of the anti-modernism that took place in the more informal public sphere of journalism and writers' self-criticism, which is an absorption for the larger Anglophone sphere of critique of modernism, which of course asserted the artwork, which was completely interested in promoting the idea of artistic works which could be subjected to reading practices that were depoliticized, formalizing, and at most scholarly in their erudition, in their documentation of things that made the work difficult. Now, difficulty, of course, was one of the things that Irish writers were militating against in their writing. They wanted plain speech, and they wanted plain style, and they wanted to communicate to a plain public. But Irish academic criticism took on the industries and became a kind of minor subsidiary. And it's not accidental, I think, that the rise of Irish academic literary criticism really took place in the 60s, along with Lamassian modernization. In other words, I think that if we look at this from a post-colonial perspective, the Irish literary criticism absorbs both from its international mentors and from a literary culture that had developed in Ireland, an antagonism to nationalism and a weak universalism that expresses itself in the depoliticization of literature entirely, and in the strong assertion of the autonomy of literature. Interestingly, the two are in profound contradiction. I think of what Treasa was just saying about the dizzying set of contradictions that are being produced. I would say that the critical industry, not only in Ireland, but more generally, lends itself to the production of the disinterested, depoliticized, and judicious subject formation of the technocrat. That in fact, the production of the subject by literary critical institutions, not least in Ireland, has been about trying to produce an intelligentsia and a class of experts that can actually work the Irish modernization process as a dependent entity within the larger circuits of capital. Accordingly, I think that when the colonial question re-emerged with great force through the Irish civil rights movement contesting a settler colonial entity in the north of Ireland, and through eventually the reoccupation of Northern Ireland by British troops and the emergence of the Republican armed struggle against that, post-colonialism as an intellectual movement and not just a question of academic criticism emerged in the effort of intellectuals to try to come to terms with a double legacy. Part of that legacy was, of course, the unfinished business of Ireland's decolonization. And of course, it came in the wake of many international anti-colonial movements, so that it came into contact with movements that had themselves been engaging with the legacies of nationalism and with metropolitan nationalist theory, which, as you know, is mostly critical of nationalism. The push of post-colonial theory, for me at least, was not about suggesting that colonialism was over, a charge often directed at it by people like Ella Shohat and Anne McClintock, for example, but rather about trying to understand anti-colonialism or decolonization from the perspective of a nationalism that had largely failed, of a state nationalism that had succeeded in reproducing dependency. And in what I'm now tempted to call the semi-detached nation of Ireland after its designation as semi-colonial and semi-peripheral, these issues were still live and emerged with great rapidity after 1968. And it became important to try to rethink Irish history from a perspective that could include not only the major thrust of state-oriented nationalism, but all the social movements that provided the larger context of the national movement itself. In that respect, post-colonial theory was an effort to try to rethink the legacy of the legacy of both subaltern movements that had moved alongside nationalism and the legacy of the nation state that had been in place. It was at once critical of nationalism and engaged with trying to understand decolonization. So in a certain sense, it recognized the failure of nationalist decolonization and was seeking for other possibilities and other options. In some senses, then, I think that post-colonialism picks up very much the modernist thrust of the revival. And that's why so many of its documents and so many of its works focus in on the period of the revival. Because if one looks at the revival, much of its characterization as backward-looking nationalism or as a form of belated romanticism crumbles. If you look even at the work of someone like D.P. Moran, all the issues of environmentalism, of a counter-modernism within a modern project are available to us already there. So what I'm trying to figure out at this juncture is what, in fact, we have as a legacy of post-colonialism, what it has to tell us about how to move beyond the official discourses of post-nationalism that have taken the form of anti-republicanism, and what we might be able to think through in terms of the relation of art practice to social movements. And I think Enda was pushing us in that direction. I'm going to leave it there because I think there's a lot more to say in discussion and several more talks to come. So I will leave it there with that expression of my perplexity as to where to take this at this particular juncture. But hopefully it's helpful to think of the ways in which that anti-modernist legacy is deeply connected with the anti-republicanism of the academic literary establishment and emerges from very much the same sources. So thank you.
Thanks so much, David. We'll move now to our next panelist before we return, I hope, to those issues. Caoilfhionn Bheacháin is a lecturer in communications at the Chemie Business School at the University of Limerick. And Caoilfhionn has published a range of essays on anti-imperialism in Ireland in the 1920s and 30s. These include treatments of anti-imperialist writing by Republicans in pamphlets and journalism, of Cumann na Mán in the later 1920s, studies of Republican links with activists in Britain and elsewhere, of Indian-Irish connections in the Free State period, and of Irish Latin American cultural linkages in literature, art, and theatre. She is currently working on the playwright Treasa on the activism and networks of the historian Alice Stopford Green, and on the topic of creative and intellectual networks more generally. You're very welcome, Caoilfhionn.
Thanks very much, Emer, and thanks, Tracy, and it's great to be here, and already I'm kind of having lots of thoughts just in response to Treasa's paper and to David's. Now, I haven't really written on my research. When I got the brief to think about, the legacies of post-colonialism, I was thinking more of, I suppose, the post-colonial debates of the 90s and the thousands and where we are now with that conversation. But I'm very glad to participate today and really happy that the Department of English at Maynooth has initiated this conversation because, I think at the moment there is a conversation that's ongoing within Ireland that has seemed kind of decontextualized. So I kind of want, I suppose I'll start and I'll think, and I suppose I am kind of speaking from just some notes and a few points, but specifically I've always been interested in the spaces, the networks and the forms of anti-colonial discourse and activisms within the Irish context. And much of my work, and I have to say, when I first read David's Nationalism Against the State, I've always been interested in that, what happens to that radical excess after of anti-imperialist activism in the new state. But I think the extent of what some people, the extent of the impact of post-colonial studies as we've known them, it's kind of difficult to map even now. I think the influences and the traces of those debates are everywhere and oddly nowhere at the moment. And post-colonial studies and its core themes and preoccupations have, in some positive senses, I think, become part of the mainstream discourse in Irish studies. Very basic concepts like Orientalism are widely understood and deployed. Treasa mentioned the last few issues of the Irish University Review, and I too was struck by that essay on precarity, that essay on social activism, and also in the last edition, there was this self-consciously inclusive and expansively imagined national community. So I think there's really positive things happening there. There's also, I know, a kind of a serious activism around the exclusionary limbo that is, say, direct provision. There was a lot of mobilization around Black Lives Matter as well. And I think as well, there's this kind of recognition of how liberatory political and cultural movements are mutually dependent. And there was a very interesting Irish Activism's conference in Oxford in 2019, which really brought together a lot of, I suppose, contributions on these different intersections and divergences between these political movements. I think as well that the widespread public anger at the official report on the mother and baby homes, you know, which is a report really on this kind of disciplinary, exclusionary kind of carceral network of the post-colonial state. You know, this report was an official response to what could be considered, I think, an extraordinary feat of subaltern historiography undertaken by Catherine Corliss. But I also think it's fair to say that the school of post-colonial thought, which made this kind of critical intervention into the political, cultural and intellectual crises of the latter decades of the 20th century, has been strangely elided in recent debates about Ireland and empire. And some of those most visible debates within the discipline of history in Ireland seems to be responding to discussions and events in the US and in Britain. And while there is some contestation about the issues in some quarters, and I might flag here the recent calls by the Daily Mail for Priya Gopal, a Cambridge professor of post-colonial studies, to be removed from her position. You know, the calls to rethink empire are coming from, I suppose, what would be considered conventionally some of the most prestigious institutions in these countries. And I'm thinking, you know, here's just, I suppose, a couple of examples. Like there's Dan Hicks, who's a Oxford professor, talking about the brutish museums. And there's also the National Trust in England looking at the relationship of big houses to slavery. So these conversations, I suppose, are becoming more mainstream. And of course, I suppose there's an awareness as well, and a kind of they're very visible because of the current popular protests regarding Black Lives Matter and the calls to decolonize in different ways. So I suppose I have a few points I'd like to make. One is on the politics of citation. And I think one way of understanding the amnesia around post-colonial studies is to place, and its place within the Irish Academy. You know, Sarah Ahmed says that citation is intellectual memory. And I really do wonder why post-colonial scholarship hasn't really been acknowledged, even in conversations specifically about empire. Now, there are exceptions to this, of course, but there are also really striking examples of this, this lack of acknowledgement, I suppose. And I think too, it's really instructive to think about, and again, Treasa kind of touched on this, about where the post-colonial scholars are located and what practical and financial and, you know, all sorts of institutional resources are there for scholars. But, you know, I think one of the interesting things I noticed recently was that interventions, there's a new special issue from Interventions on a really interesting comparative work between South Africa and Ireland. And I think I'm right in saying that there wasn't any contributor actually based at the Irish university. And I suppose there is just, I think, the politics of citation, but also about recruitment, about kind of financial resourcing. There is, you know, all those issues around precarity as well. So I would ask what happened to post-colonial studies in Ireland about Ireland. And it's not something I can kind of answer now, but it is a question I wanted to raise, particularly as we engage with calls to decolonize education. You know, and I suppose because as someone like Tuck and Yang assert, you know, decolonization isn't actually, you know, it's not a metaphor. It's kind of, it's both urgent, but it's a long-term process of change, reflection, and redress. And it's difficult to see how we can decolonize without the conceptual toolkit provided by post-colonial studies. Yeah, so I think interdisciplinarity is kind of needed as an instrument of decolonization. And, you know, post-colonial studies within Ireland, but more generally, you know, spoke to and complemented other discourses. It was by its nature interdisciplinary, you know, it connected with intersectional feminism, but also with methodologies, I think, like oral history. You know, and I think the attention to things like non-elite agency, to conceptions of temporality that were non-linear, that were interrupted. I suppose my particular interest was on horizontal forms of comradeship between the colonized peripheries, to uneven development, to epistemological violence, to conceptions of, you know, the canonicity, to nationalisms against and in excess of the state. And there was a real alertness, I think, to the complexity of power relationships in given moments and contexts. And of course, you know, I suppose one of the amazing things of the last year of, and, you know, the strange things, I suppose, is that I find myself often now in virtual seminar rooms all over the world. And it is, to my mind, really interesting to see how, you know, Emer, you mentioned at the start just, you know, had, I suppose, the ends of post-colonialism, but what I can see is that post-colonialism is thriving, and you know, it's now overlapping with critical race theory, with the environmental humanities, as Treasa said, with indigenous studies, and so forth. And I suppose the flexibility of the discourse and the breadth of scholarship has made it kind of tremendously enabling. And, you know, and frequently, and I think David mentioned this, you know, it is politically charged because its priorities are often connected to movements for social change. So they're just some thoughts on where post-colonialism is right now. And I just want to briefly look at, I suppose, one exchange in the current, I suppose, Machnamh project that seems to illuminate the kind of stasis in the debate here at times. Now, Machnamh is kind of an effort to engage with the legacy of empire in Irish history. And, you know, it's I suppose, for anyone that doesn't know, it's has been initiated by President Michael D. Higgins. But after the last Machnamh seminar, the communications officer at Áras an Uachtaráin took what I think is quite an unusual step of writing to the Irish Times to object to the headline that they had used to summarise the president's contribution to the debate. And the paper had led with the title, you know, President says that the Irish were willing agents of empire. Now, anyone that listened to his speech, I think, would attest that actually this was a really mischievous, kind of misleading summary. You know, it wasn't really what he said at all. And I think as well, you know, I suppose I just want to draw, and I'm going to quote it, one of the comments that came up in the debate that I think highlights some of the challenges that we face in these current discussions. And a senior historian made the comment that, and I'm going to quote, and this is I wish to briefly say a few words on some other aspects of empire which we are not accustomed to remembering. The historian Cormac O'Grada has reminded us that in the devastating famine of the 1940s, emigration was a lifeline that allowed many Irish people to survive, enabled them to get employment, it freed up resources in Ireland so that those who stayed could manage, and it helped successive generations build futures that simply were not possible in Ireland. Australia, Canada, New Zealand, Britain, parts of Africa, and of course the US all became homes for Irish people during the 17th, 18th, 19th, 20th, and now 21st centuries, all of which had become part of the British Empire at one time. The feigned amnesia that the empire was somehow divorced from the dominions and territories through which millions of Irish people actively chose to make their home is an important reality that coexisted with the more negative narratives of empire that are now commonly recalled. So the empire, I just want to briefly touch on what's happening here. The empire is obviously depoliticized. It's harmless. It's an ostensibly innocent backdrop to famine, to poverty, to land hunger, and to the massive emigration that happened at that time with the enormous human cost. And this framing makes immigration kind of an active, almost like a lifestyle choice. And it elides the impact of these displaced and, you know, frequently, obviously, traumatized and impoverished peoples on the subsequent encounters that they had at the frontiers of empire. Spaces, as we know, which also had their own inhabitants. So, you know, indigenous peoples who were completely erased in this kind of account. And I think what was particularly jarring about this framing of the famine and the mass emigration that has defined Irish society and created the extensive diaspora is that in his paper, which was the starting point, I suppose, and the historians were kind of making responses, he had referenced Priya Satya's work. Now, Priya Satya is a Stanford historian, and drawing on subaltern studies and post-colonial theory, her work examines the discipline of history as a formation of knowledge that has been instrumentalized to defend the notion of liberal progress and to obfuscate the violent excesses of imperial power. And she kind of demonstrates how future-orientated claims of progress or retrospective justification actively represses ethical judgment in the present. And she also argues, and touching on what Enda mentioned in the last, that, you know, capitalist realism is propelling us towards kind of catastrophe, and that we have to really start looking at the stories that we're telling ourselves about empire, about kind of capitalism as we know it. And you know, not just the catastrophe which we face, but for many people has already arrived. So I think Mockniv 100 is an interesting intervention, but to date, you know, the president has invited only professional historians to I suppose, to discuss commemoration and empire. And I think, I suppose, one of the things I'd say is that format obviously has its limitations, and it has resulted in contributions that have not considered the role of literature, culture, aesthetics, art, or performance, or engaged with insights from post-colonial studies. And I suppose I just briefly, before I finish, wanted to quickly draw attention to, I suppose, some of the positive things that are happening in this this field, I mean, around commemoration, around memory. You know, yesterday was the 102nd anniversary in Limerick, where I am, of the Limerick Soviet. And I think the programme of events for the centenary in 2019 suggested what is possible in terms of commemoration. And what we had was, you know, artists and small businesses collaborated on a project to bring currency, a kind of a commemorative currency, to life for a month. The City U project had, you know, they made Soviet bread to the recipe of the time, which was sold in the local co-op. There were workshops on topics like feminist economics. The trade unions had an exhibition of ephemera from strikes and activism in the 70s and 80s. There were podcasts and public debates, and there was an extraordinary site-specific theatre event at the old factory that gave thousands of city dwellers an ephemeral and a kind of fragmentary insight into the strike. And I think, I suppose, just thinking about some of the other work, I mean, David mentioned Mark Quigley's work, he mentioned Nikki Allen's work, and I would also add to that, say, someone like Stephen O'Neill, who's working on partition at the moment, and kind of who looks at the kind of competing discourses and narrations in a variety of historical or literary and artistic texts. And now, just to finish, I suppose, in Slow Violence, which and the environmentalism of the poor, Rob Nixon wonders how we can act ethically towards human and biotic communities that exist beyond our sensory ken. Particularly when immediate corporate and consumer demands are elevated above the consequences of the long-term slow violence against human health and the Earth's biosphere. He notes that, quote, "It is a pervasive condition of empire that they affect great swathes of the planet without the empire's populace being aware of that impact. Indeed, without being aware that many of the affected areas even exist." End of quote. And Nixon said it is kind of writers and artists who give this kind of imaginative definition to the slow violence of late capitalism. And he makes the argument as well that post-colonial studies and theory is essential for reshaping our conceptual priorities. And I think an academic field, and I'm thinking about Irish studies now, is a field of vision. It's about who and what you train yourself to see. And the invisible architecture of empire in its many manifestations needs to become visible so that it can be consciously felt, experienced, and understood. And to my mind, post-colonial studies still provides us with this set of tools for examining such formations of power and privilege, for examining the history of aesthetics, canon formation, and curricular bias. And it raises questions as well about who is cited, who is employed, and who is just included within the academy. I'll leave it there.
Many thanks, Caoilfhionn. Thank you. We will move now to our fourth panelist, Lionel Pilkington, who is professor in the Department of English in NUIG Galway, and where he teaches drama and theatre studies, Irish writing, and cultural politics. Together with colleagues in NUIG, Lionel was among the organizer of a series of 6 international conferences on colonialism between 1992 and 2010 on topics including gender and colonialism, settler colonialism, and India and Ireland. These memorable events brought keynote speakers, including Gayatri Spivak, Deepesh Chakrabarti, Barbara Harlow, and Gauri Viswanathan, into dialogue with Irish studies scholars and students at that time, and also featured agenda-setting contributions by a range of Irish speakers, including, I believe, our panelist David Lloyd, which Caoilfhionn has mentioned. Lionel has also taught on the MA course on culture and colonialism in Galway, which has now been running for some 27 years. He's the author of Theatre and State in 20th Century Ireland and Theatre and Ireland, and co-editor of several of the volumes of essays that arose from the Galway conferences, including Gender and Colonialism and Studies in Settler Colonialism, Identity, Politics and Culture. So we'll move over to yourself, Lionel, if you're on the line.
Yep, I think. Good. Can you see me and hear me? I hope you can. Good, yes.
I think we're
Wonderful.
good, yeah.
Great, well, thank you so much, Emer, and thank you, Tracy, as well, Tracy O'Flaherty, for helping set things up. And thank you and your colleagues for this series of seminars and for so generously inviting me. So, with the benefits of hindsight, it does seem quite extraordinary that the flowering of post-colonial studies in Ireland synchronized so perfectly with the entrenchment in Ireland, as well as in other countries, of the idea that the primary role of the sovereign nation state was that of promoting and enforcing agendas of privatization and individual profit over and against any obligation by the state to redistribute resources or provide social care. And moreover, that this should take place alongside a normalization of the idea of citizenship as an entitlement to a set of rights whose benefits might only be properly enjoyed if measured against the visible and the visibility and palpability of others who did not have these rights or any entitlement to them. But that these connections were not visible to us at the time. I'm speaking with a plural, but I'm speaking primarily for myself. That these connections were not visible to me or to us at the time was not due to any Manichaean overemphasis on empire, but rather to our failure, I think, to engage more rigorously with empire as a system for organizing the world according to a program of accelerated capitalist accumulation and the corresponding impacts of this in terms of living together in common. Broadly speaking, our focus was culturalist. We opted not for imperialism as the main keyword, but for the then slightly more institutionally hospitable colonialism, a term that refers more immediately to regimes of settlement and cultural domination, rather than to a dynamic of global economic exploitation and its continuation and its aftermath. Another related difficulty, I believe, was the usually unspoken belief that the sovereign state could still serve as a principal arena for political change. That is, by taking over the state or by putting into power a sufficiently robust socialist political grouping, it would be possible, it might be possible to set things right by setting the clock back to the heydays of the welfare state, les Trente Glorieuses, or Ireland's brief decade of what was known as industrial democracy in the 1970s. We believed this, or we half believed and half hoped for it, despite all the evidence mounting up like wreckage in front of us, and that pointed indisputably to the contrary. In France, François Mitterrand's shift to the right in the mid-1980s. In Europe in general, the Maastricht Treaty of 1992 that established the overarching authority of the European Central Bank and its rules governing how governments might manage public debt. And in England, of course, the rise of Tony Blair's capitalist-friendly New Labour and the Third Way. In some ways, I think, in a great many ways, I think, these failures on our part to make a proper connection between the study of imperialism in Ireland and the evolving conditions that dominate our shared lives in this country explains to me why, although the MA in Culture and Colonialism still exists, and actually I'm the program director at the moment, it does so precariously, and largely thanks to international students. Our recruitment of Irish students is very poor. And I think it is very poor because the program, or that us, or me in particular, that making the connection between the program and between people's lived experience in Ireland under neoliberalism hasn't been made clear enough. So I think there's a huge swathe of work that remains to be done, and that's sort of what I want to talk about. Not that this is because there is any lack today of prominent discussion of Ireland's relationship with empire, as Caoilfhionn mentioned in the previous contribution. Pronouncements on Ireland's relationship with the British Empire are almost as regular a feature of Irish public life as are visits to this island by members of the British royal family. But unlike the early 1990s, when the question being asked at conferences was, is Ireland a third world country? The tendency today is to follow Paul Ricoeur's idea of narrative hospitality, so as to make the case that while Ireland was undoubtedly a victim of imperial violence, many Irish people also served as its most zealous perpetrators. There is a distinctive preoccupation with naturalizing the practices of imperialist violence as part of Ireland's collective history. As is often pointed out, the person responsible for the Jallianwala Bagh massacre at Amherst in 1919 was Irish. Brigadier General Reginald Dyer, the man who instructed his 50 riflemen to keep firing on an unarmed crowd in an enclosed space until all their bullets were spent, and until at least 379 people were killed, probably many, many more, and 1,500 injured, was educated, like myself, at Middleton College in County Cork, while Sir Michael O'Dwyer, the governor of the Punjab, and who heartily approved of these actions, came from a landed family in County Tipperary. Nowadays in Ireland, as Jane Olmar put it in the Irish Times in early February, the British Empire is something that some excoriate and some celebrate. Olmar's argument is that the legacy of imperialism in Ireland ought to be studied so that it can be revised, made more progressive, and put to work for the future. Instead of the bellicose racism of a Boris Johnson, we can have something more progressive, more European. In her words, nation states working together in federations like the EU, which are the mainstay of our world today. Olmar, of course, is not alone in this view. And while President Michael D. Higgins, writing about his Machnamh project, rightly points out the disinclination in both academic and journalistic accounts to critique empire and imperialism, and he notes that the mask of modernity has often been used for cultural suppression, economic exploitation, dispossession, and domination. While he does say these things, his project is also directed towards accelerating us into the future, to forge a better future together, respecting the fact that different perspectives exist, so as, in his words, to unburden us of history's capacity to create obstacles to a better shared future. Now, the objective of this project, that is to accept, with whatever misgivings we have, our imperial legacy and to move on, amounts to what Rancière, talking about the practice of consensus in nation states, describes as the erasure of the boundary between law and fact, law and lawlessness. The implications of retaining the outcome of imperial violence as fact, and this I would describe as the Ulmer and the Michael D. Higgins project, means normalizing citizenship as differential. As Ariela Azoulay points out in her book, Potential History, Unlearning Imperialism, the idea that's normalized is the idea that our citizenship can only be realized if it can be experienced as a set of rights that are against and at the expense of others who share the same space as us, same social and political space as us, but are deprived of these rights. It is also a way of addicting us to violence or inoculating us to a violence that is vital to the maintenance of the citizenship and therefore to the perpetuation of a violence. It's not difficult to see how this is manifest in Ireland today, not just in the shooting dead by Gardaí of the young man of colour George Nakencho in Dublin on 30th of December last year, but it's also evident in Ireland's response to the COVID-19 pandemic and its xenophobic obsession with the biosecurity of the sovereign individual carried forward to the level of the sovereign state, but to a sovereign state bound with almost biblical dedication to privatization and profit. Under imperial rule, writes Azoulay, there is no longer a common world to care for, but only scattered enclaves to protect. And just as the triumphant announcements of the late 1990s and early 2000s heralded Ireland as the most globalized country in the world, and also the one with the second highest inequality index, and this was followed by the 2004 citizenship referendum that revoked citizenship rights to children born of non-Irish citizens, there is nothing remotely surprising about Ireland now possessing in Europe, and perhaps also in the world, the most privatized, most expensive, and most punitive quarantine detention centers for international travel. As with neoliberal capitalism and austerity, Ireland once again leads the way in Europe in rehearsing what is already being mooted in European capitals as a detention center, as detention system for travelers from the Southern Hemisphere. As Jane Ulmer points out quite correctly, Ireland indeed contributes substantially to what she describes as the mainstay of our world today, federated nations working together in a kind of governance. So it's unpicking that, finding a way to break away from that. That is surely one of our urgent tasks. So for possibilities of hope, for possibilities of how Ireland's commitment to a toxic differential citizenship can be exposed and broken up so that other possibilities for co-citizenship might emerge, I want now to turn to Tremble, a multimedia and performance work done by Jesse Jones in collaboration with the actor Olwen Fueri. Representing Ireland at the Venice Biennale in 2017, Tremble was commissioned by Tessa Giblin and had a sound score by Susan Stenger. It was devised and performed in the period immediately prior to the 2008 referendum on the Eighth Amendment. It was influenced by the Italian feminist Silvia Federici and the Irish feminist and legal activist and academic Mairead Enright. And it was an attempt not only to support the campaign to repeal the Eighth Amendment, but also to extend this idea of repeal to the law itself, so as to reconfigure the ways in which we think about citizenship outside the current limiting possibilities of a totalizing capitalist hegemony. In Jones's own words, it was about changing the imaginary around the law in this threshold of change. And as we'll see in just a moment, and it's almost impossible to get a full sense of the performance from a clip, but I'm going to try and show a clip. This show involves film pieces of Fuere as a giant that is projected on transparent curtains on curved rails that are pulled over and back by performers in the exhibition space, a giant millstone and a granite wall on which a performer scratches out a circle. The effect of this piece is a disturbing practice of dissensus, whereby the spectator in the exhibition space is compelled to experience her relation to space and to history in new ways. What it suggests is that the idea of unlearning imperialism is the only alternative to accepting imperialism's poisonous legacy. And this involves a kind of havoc with time and with space. There's a playing havoc with history in the sense that this work evokes a number of diverse key moments, from the cry of the Italian wages for housework feminists in 1972, Tremble, Tremble, the witches are back, to the replica elbow bone of the a giant replica elbow bone of the 3.2 million year fossil Lucy Australopithecus, to the 1682 oral testimonies of Temperance Lloyd, one of the last women in England to be executed as a witch. In all of this, what is given expression is the idea of reversing history through a rejection of the taxonomies bequeathed to us by imperialism and that are still being experienced today as if they were law. And as one point, which I'm going to show in the clip that I'm going to show, Olwen Fuere speaks the words of Temperance Lloyd just before she was executed. And these words might well be used as a description, not just of the piece as a whole, but of the kind of dissensual project that post-colonialism today may need to promote. Did I disturb ye, good people? I hopes I disturb ye. I hopes I disturb ye enough to want to see this, your house in ruins about ye. So I'm just going to try and show this to you. And just 1 second.
I hopes I disturb ye enough to want to see this, your house in ruins all around you. Before the book of the law was written in earthly tongues, there existed another law.
Right. That's it. Thank you very much, Emer.
Thank you, Lionel. Thank you. We'll move now to our final panelist, Malcolm Sen. Malcolm teaches in the Department of English at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. His research focuses on questions of justice, statecraft, and post-colonial politics as they emerge in this contemporary moment of climate crisis. He's the co-editor of Post-Colonial Studies and the Challenges of the New Millennium and of the New Race in Irish Literature and Culture. He's also author of the forthcoming Cambridge History of Irish Literature and the Environment, and is currently working on a new book entitled Unnatural Disasters, Irish Literature, Climate Change and Sovereignty. Over to you, Malcolm.
Emer, Tracy, thank you so much, and to the department as well for inviting me to share my thoughts with you today. I have some images to show you, so I'm going to try and share my screen, and I hope that'll work. That should be visible to all of you. So I'm going to try and keep it to about 15 minutes if I can, and trying to assert really the linkages between pandemics, politics, and post-coloniality today. And this is because for me, all politics and all theory is sieved through the webwork of ecology. The SARS-CoV-2 pandemic has made many of us question what we mean by normal life under the neoliberal extractivist regimes we collectively inhabit. Within weeks of the virus's global spread, popular journalism, academic scholarship, and pandemic punditry bemoaned the multiple insecurities unleashed by this zoonotic infectious disease. Its ramifications for individuals, societies, and governments made everyday life appear uncertain to a degree that the global north, I suppose, had not experienced since the Second World War. There was talk of a new normal. Let me see if I can just change my screen here. We were all living by proxy, as we continue to do so now, living as it were through digital prosthetic devices. Upon reflection, it seems that the virus manifested in many ways, but apart from its ability to infect human bodies, its other enduring visceral presence affected our experience of space and time. A pathogenic agent, a biological entity, a submicroscopic monster, a virus intercepts the linear progression of time. Viruses are also historical revenants presently animated, but already haunt the future. They call into question, I suppose, the ideological fabric of linearity through which is threaded the dogma of progress, including post-colonial progress. They proclaim the threads of connectivity between distant locations through routes of transmission, a global circuit of inhalations and exhalations, sipping and spitting, injecting and excreting. In their pandemic form, viruses behave as paradigms, bifurcating both space and time, life before outbreak and the one after, so that their origins become significant and resonant with symbolic value. In their spatial form, viruses agitate neat spatial demarcations, including those of competing sovereignties. This new normal seemed to be one of utter uncertainty. We did not know so much. Charlie Wurzel's opinion piece in the New York Times elaborated on all the questions that remained unanswered in the early months of COVID-19. We don't know, we don't know, we don't know, ran Wurzel's commentary. The uncertainty led The Atlantic to go on to historicize the deployment of the word normalcy to the post-Spanish flu world of 1920s US politics. A commentator in the Irish Times reported that once upon a time, we mainly associated this word, virus, with technology. I wish to make three observations that are based on this platform of COVID talk. And I think that directly and indirectly speak to Ireland's post-colonial project. So observation one, this time is truly out of joint. Analogies do not do justice to the intricate webwork of causality that braid together extractivist regimes, climate change, and infectious diseases. However, accelerating transmission of disease that rapidly turns into a global pandemic and the environmental breakdown which facilitates it ultimately rattle historical progress that make the past vibrantly legible in the present. After all, pathogenic agents like SARS-CoV-2 are animated revenants. Their deep slumber, once ended, haunt the present, and also, of course, threaten to shape all future life. Carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere behave in a similar fashion. Their effects are felt decades after emissions. The present moment of unseasonable seasons and crisis-laden unpredictability is not a product of divine diktat, but is rather man-made, gendered in this way. Weather ceased to be in the realm of gods more than 200 years ago and is the product of countless acts of combustion. So that in the Anthropocene, as Andreas Malm describes it, we can never be in the heat of the moment, only in the heat of this ongoing past. With some relative hindsight and some critical thinking, it appears that the pre-COVID planet was not that normal after all either. Take, for example, Ireland. The litany of names that have shaped the nomenclature of 21st century Ireland is itself crisis-ridden. There is little that is normal here. Phrases like financial crisis, debt crisis, sovereign debt crisis, banking crisis, and economic crisis obviously regularly featured in newspaper columns after the death of the Celtic Tiger. But other concurrent crises that emerge in public discourse at the same time point to a destabilization of the geopolitical order, not simply global capital's economic structure. Examples here would include the asylum crisis and the refugee crisis. Even in the post-austerity, economically resurgent Ireland of pre-COVID times, the phrase housing crisis resounded deeply in public discourse. The further addition of the Brexit crisis reintroduced the language of territorial sovereignty in Ireland in the last few years, and now is predicting a looming border crisis. In fact, when it comes to the unprecedented nature of COVID, there is little that is unprecedented. Mike Davis described it quite well recently. Coronavirus, he says, is the old movie that we've been watching over and over again since Richard Preston's The Hudson in 1994. So the question, I suppose, that needs asking over and over again might be, how do we animate the interface between extractive capital, neoliberal statism, and the possibility of biological life on Earth? I want to very quickly show you 5 or so slides that will give you a sense of the precedented nature of these allegedly unprecedented times. This is an image, of course, from China, Wuhan, these hastily built COVID hospitals. And here is an image of army trucks carrying coffins of COVID dead in Italy, Bergamo, I think. Here's a picture from the Spanish flu of 1918. And here is a picture of the trucks carrying coffins of 1918 flu dead in New York. If we thought our fascinations with masks began in 2020, well, even in that case, we see we have a long history that we have collectively been made to forget. Observation 2, some are preparing for war. Anne McClintock connects the dots between 3 disasters in the Anthropocene: climate chaos, global militarization, and the mass displacement of people and other species. She notes that the established circuits that connect these crises have been ghosted. Origins are never originary. So the argument runs that the circuits that connect these crises, this invisibility, this ghosting, is what has been normal, and there is little that is new about it. Both pre- and post-Celtic Tiger critique often actually repeat, to my mind, such ghostings when it speaks of state, sovereignty, and security in purely economic or political terms. Climate change predicts the grim emergence of a new era of geopolitical violence arising from ecological breakdown. Is climate change an international studies problem? Soaked with the rhetoric of conflict, climate chaos appears to be occurring most visibly at the, and I quote, front lines. To address it, international actors are waging a war on climate change. Scientists are performing threat assessments of local ecologies, and environmental activists are confronting big oil for waging a war against mitigation efforts. Such rhetoric brings to fruition what the military-industrial complex predicted in relation to climate change, that it is, quote, a threat multiplier. Whether the lived experience of climate may appear to have only tangential connections with warfare, at the same time, both history and journalism point towards ecology's capacity to radically upend political realities. I would say that the history of ecological imperialism in Ireland, the ground zero, so to speak, of empire as we understand it today, needs a more sustained engagement within post-colonial studies. To do this will also mean addressing the colour and gender blindness of Irish post-colonial studies, keeping in mind that all roads, as Nancy Fraser phrased it just a few weeks ago, lead to one idea, namely capitalism. It seems to me that in the 21st century, even as the rhetoric of nationalism gains popularity, sovereignty itself will be determined by particulate matter, atomic dust, vaporous emanations, and turbid fluids, all of which, like COVID, are averse to securitized borders, and all of which are the byproducts of capital. There is little doubt that the nation-state model is increasingly under threat in an age of diminishing returns, which asks us in turn to revise critical goals. In other words, a new rethinking of the twin-engined theory machine that has propelled Irish post-colonial assessments, the nation-state and modernity. Should we recall the potentiality here of the Third World hypothesis, a once viable attempt to rewrite the circumferent grammar of empire? The early 21st century is a time when cross-border transgressions, migrancy and exile, poverty and precarity are increasingly becoming normative conditions of the marginalized subject. Since the landscape in which the Westphalian logic of statehood emerged is no more, although it continues to have multiple iterations in post-colonial contexts, communities that were already at the margins of the post-colonial nation are now doubly sidelined in the hostile grammar of borders, walls, and security checkpoints. The border is where war begins. It is also a place where war talk can come to an end. McClintock writes, "The planet is Ori. We awakened oil from its ancient slumber to fuel our fossil dreams. We combusted the deep time of the past, aeons of compressed ocean shells, ancient plants and animal bones, into an alchemy of black energy and our fantasy of a forever fossil future. Now the ice sheets are vanishing faster than ever thought possible. Greenland is melting. The ice is leaving Iceland. Lightning torches the tundra, turning permafrost into permafire. Firestorms so vast they are visible from space rage across Amazonia, Australia, Siberia. In Harare, Zimbabwe, the taps run dry. Farmers watch mile-high dust storms rub out the sky. The great burnings of the trees, the vanishing of the bees, and everywhere the stealthy rising of the seas." For a politics of life, rather than for war, demands an engagement with migrant and marginal lives at a time of militarized statehood. This is the principal lesson to be taken from the silences noticeable in the history of Irish post-colonial studies. Essentially, this will necessitate a real bridging of the impasse between feminist politics and post-colonial frameworks, which, as it turns out, is absolutely crucial to fathom the ecological imperialisms embedded in the post-colonial condition. To do so, I would say we need to locate narratives from edge worlds, from communities at littoral locations, at the hinterlands of capital and state. The bayous of New Orleans and the tidal islands of the Bay of Bengal, for example, are geographically distant and politically disparate, but are two hot and humid locations that highlight how statehood is being militarized around the theme of climate change. The precarity of life and the lack of the protection of the state also extends to the margins of the state, to minority cultures and those modes of living that have been made invisible to the workings of statehood. Edge worlds like these prioritize the refugee, the fugitive, the marginalized, and the stateless. And the narratives emerging from such spaces should be, I would say, central to any anti-colonial post-statist deliberations on climate chaos. The marginalized counters the geological term often used to define the present, the Anthropocene. I have a few more minutes. Should I go on or should I just stop here, Emer? You tell me.
Take your time, Malcolm. Yeah, sum up in your own time. That's fine.
Great, thank you. So the final observation then, the apocalypse is in the past. Perhaps rather than asking what survives after extinction, the critical task in the Anthropocene is to reimagine the very narrative of extinction that underwrites it. Now seen from the perspective of the margins, the recognition dawns that this is not the typical Anthropocene tale. Indeed, indigenous subjects and actors offer a timely reassessment of the racial capitalist architecture of the Anthropocene. Nicholas Mirzoff clarifies the racist assumptions of the Anthropocene through the lens of a geological color line. He asks, what does it mean to say Black Lives Matter in the context of the Anthropocene? Noting that the Anthropocene thesis depends on a single physical manifestation of a change recorded in a stratigraphic section of Earth, often reflecting a global change phenomena, he goes on to challenge the visibility of this requirement through the invisibilization of racial violence encoded in the stratigraphy of empire, and we can extend that to post-colonial nationhood as well. COVID-19 cracks open the neoliberal safe house, I would say, of business as usual politics, if we pay attention to the forms of sovereign power being enacted at a time of emergency. Speaking of the new regimes of untouchability ushered in by COVID, Mukul Kesavan writes that COVID-19 is a desi, that is an Indian disease, accidentally invented by the Chinese. He talks of COVID Brahmanism in the Indian context. In an article that was published earlier this year, I wrote along similar lines on Ireland's sovereign power over bodies of colour under its care during a time of crisis. To the final slide, Bon Vivir, or Politics for Life. So let me come to a close by noting that for a politics of life, a form of ecological citizenship and the free mobility of all biological life may appear to be tall orders, juridically speaking. But the alleged utopianism also signals a crisis of imagination, and one that is unsurprisingly being addressed from the margins. The Ecuadorian assertion of the constitutional rights of nature, its insistence on bon vivir or good living, is a model that resolutely counteracts the cynicism of the American dream and also the limitations of the Westphalian logic that intercepts post-coloniality. No doubt that there are internal inconsistencies and local tribulations which alert us yet again to the perils of exoticism. But being inspired by alternative epistemologies, alternative modes of life, cannot mean not being able to foster and emulate them in distant contexts. Indeed, emulation does not logically lead to appropriation. Is another world possible? Arundhati Roy's answer is inspirational. Another world is not only possible, she is on her way. On a quiet day, I can hear her breathing. Thank you, and I'll stop there.
Thank you, Malcolm, and thanks to our 5 panelists for their contributions this afternoon. We have some time remaining for discussion and for comments. I'd like to hand you over to my colleague Michael, who will invite responses from our panelists from the previous session. And in the meantime, I'd ask people to try to include your comments or questions in the chat, and I will try to read as much as I can and feed back a couple of those points to our panelists.
Thanks, Emer. And just to reiterate what Emer was saying there about everybody attending, if you've got questions, to put them there into the chat. As I was listening there to Malcolm's really provocative and really actually quite lyrical evocation of the moment we're in, and really insightful evocation of the moment we're in, I was thinking of I was reminded of this line from Benjamin in the Thesis on History, where he says that the tradition of the oppressed teaches us that the state of emergency in which we live is not the exception but the rule. And that seemed to really, for me, kind of capture in some ways the essence of the contributions this afternoon. What has been, for me, most powerful is the reminder of the absolute, seems to me, necessity, the absolute indispensable nature of post-colonial criticism, post-colonial theory, for thinking about the world in which we live in now, the absolute necessity of having a framework, having a model of thought for thinking about empire and capitalism, or capitalism as empire, I suppose, for confronting the crisis in which we confront now, or the interrelated crises, as Malcolm and Treasa have both pointed out to us: racism, the ecological catastrophe, gender oppression. What's most important about, it seems to me, about post-colonial theory is that it helps us to capture that it's not that these are crises in some sort of punctual event that we are, a punctual sense that we are confronting now, or that these are even interrelated or interconnected crises. Rather, the crisis is itself capitalism. This is not a crisis of capitalism. The capitalist world system is itself a crisis. And I guess that, as I say, is what is being sort of most invigorating about this afternoon, because we've kind of, particularly in Irish studies and Irish literary studies, we've kind of almost gotten used to a framework or a framing of questions, political questions, literary questions, theoretical questions, intellectual questions, in which repudiating post-colonial theory is conceptualized as progressive commitment to whether it is anti-racism, feminism, ecological commitments, or whatever, that there's that sort of equation between those two. And so what's been, as I say, so important about this afternoon is the reminder of the necessity of post-colonial theory for thinking about these. So for instance, for thinking about the relationship between literature, literary criticism, and emancipatory politics, which David was reminding of us and giving us that really insightful history of the relationship between anti-modernism in Irish literature, particularly the poetry, the conservatism of the poetry, and the anti-modernism and the connection between anti-modernism and anti-post-colonial thinking in Irish academia. But not just relationship between literature, literary criticism, and emancipatory politics, which Caoilfhionn was also reminding us of, and of course the politics of hope, which was the word that Lionel used there very powerfully in the middle of his brilliant connection between those twin sort of developments, forcing us to think about the fact that there is this fascinating historical confluence between the ascendancy of a kind of neoliberal hegemony and the moment, for want of a better word, of post-colonial theory in Irish studies. And I was just also doing Caoilfhionn's contribution, which was really useful for thinking about the present moment and thinking about those discourses that are going on. And again, that sort of fascinating point that she raised, that, you know, there's this discourse that is there coming sort of at sort of the intersection of journalism and academic discourse around decolonization. And it reminded me of a conversation that I had by email with our colleague Conor McCarthy about this recently, and we were both noticing this odd kind of fact that you know, it was from the discipline of history that the most vociferous assaults on post-colonial literary theory and Irish studies came from, and now here we have historians leading the demand for, we must decolonize the curriculum, we must decolonize the university, we must figure out, and we must spend a lot of time and money figuring out, was Trinity involved with imperialism? That's a really tricky question that we might have to spend a lot of time figuring out, that, you know, a university that was part of a colonial project from the get-go might or might not have been involved with imperialism. But Caoilfhionn's point was absolutely spot on. And I've been thinking, it's put into words what Conor and I were thinking about. You know, how exactly do you think about decolonization without the toolkit of post-colonial theory? And this has been one of the, it seems to me, over the last year or so, one of the, as Caoilfhionn's pointed out, one of the sort of bizarre contradictions in public discourse about this question. This attempt to think about decolonization without thinking about empire and capitalism using the frameworks of post-colonial theory. So what I'm trying to get across is this afternoon has been amazingly insightful, amazing, sort of invigorating, and for me, and for sort of helping me to sort of giving me sort of, you know, I suppose a way of responding to these debates that have been going on in the last while, and sort of the oddness that they've taken. And what I suppose this afternoon is helping me kind of grasp is the oddness is precisely the lack of a model for thinking about capitalism and empire. Perhaps we would go to our two, first of all, before we come to our attendees, we might just come to our returning participants from the last event. Perhaps we might start with you, Enda, if you're happy to lead us off with some responses. I think you might be muted there, Enda, or your microphone is muted. Obviously, you're not.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
That's good. Honestly, this was, you know, honestly stunning. I mean, what I'd note instantly, I imagine everybody had this reaction. Each paper was in a discernibly different key, which, you know, makes it very hard to, you've done a great job already, Michael, to sort of, to unify, to give you some sort of quick story. But I mean, here's just a few quick thoughts. All the way, let's go back to Treasa, you know, talking about the precarity of the young professoriate, right? All the way, you know, I go all the way from there to Malcolm's, when Malcolm put up the picture of the burning mountainside, I realized with horror or shock that it quite possibly was a picture of Santa Barbara, where I'm sitting right now, a couple of years ago with those 3 palm trees, you know. But from that to that picture, from, you know, from the impossibility of employment for professors, one key between all the papers I thought was, let's go back to the old concept of the organic intellectual. You know, the idea of who do any of us actually speak for? And it seems to me that in a way, what we're all lamenting is kind of a way in which we're prevented from being organic intellectuals. I'm not sure who's doing that preventing exactly, but you know, like even those from Lionel's invocation of Dyer and O'Dwyer, you know, and their responsibilities and their guilt to ourselves as people who, how would I put it? It's somehow we're always not quite sure who we should be speaking for. The possibility to have a kind of a direct, you know, the poor cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. The Irish cannot represent themselves, they must be represented. Certainly, I've been obsessed a bit myself with the immigrants, you know, and that whole thing about Cormac McGraw that Caoilhphionn was reporting on, the Historians Initiative. The idea that the immigrant perhaps is key to everything here, because the immigrant sort of is a figure, as I was trying to say the last day, I think, who represents the worst case scenario of this. You know, is the immigrant some sort of, you know, imperialist? Is the immigrant sort of the avant-gardist, not of culture, but of indeed global capitalism for Ireland? Or is the, you know, or is the immigrant some sort of, you know, inheritor of the famine tradition, right? But in every case, it's sort of that there seems to be a kind of a breakdown of the possibility of doing the work of representation. I don't know if this is pushing too fast. And how do we overcome that? I mean, one thing that kept occurring to me that was on the tip of everybody's tongue or consciousness, but didn't quite ever get mentioned, was the hoary concept of class. You know, even in the last couple of minutes when we were laughing at the idea of Trinity College as imperialist, you know, handmaiden or mouthpiece or whatever, it's class we're really invoking. And maybe most of all, you know, Lionel brought this up in some ways, because obviously it intersects with say, feminism and the new sort of race stories. I've gone on too long already. Let me say one last thing, I guess. How would I put it? Well, it's like, you know, post-colonial studies. We're a victim, in a sense, it has become a sort of a common concept. We've gone from post-colonial studies, which indeed never underestimate the forces ranging against them in Irish academia, but in the world in general, I think the narrative of post-coloniality has been massively successful and persuasive in the world, to the point where now the story is about a decolonization. So where does that leave us as potential organic intellectuals is what kind of I see as the problem. Does that make any sense? You know, who are we just speaking for? I don't know, I don't want to pick on you, Malcolm, but something like, are we speaking on behalf of nature itself? You know, how do we go from some old kind of indeed state-based story of, you know, the post-colonial world of politics as some sort of what you call Westphalian sort of, you know, framework politics, to a kind of a global biopolitics? Where does Ireland fit into a world of global biopolitics? And can we speak for specific groups or communities of people, as opposed to speaking for, I don't know, nature itself on a global scale? I better shut up at that point. Excuse me.
Thanks very much. And I thought that was really good. Summary, you raised some clarifying points there and connections. And also, I think, you know, framing it around that whole sort of question, which, as you point out, came up again and again around the idea of a commitment and the idea of the organic intellectual, that connection between post-colonial theory and emancipatory political movements or movements of resistance, which, you know, looking across the speakers, ranging from, you know, David talking about the revival in the early 20th century up to Treasa Malcolm's, contemporary movements, and also Caoilhion's historical perspective, I guess, or Caoilhion's historical and also, I suppose, international perspective, and that she was very much reminding us of that international frame. Joe, do you want to come in at this point?
Yeah, thank you, Michael. And thanks to all the speakers. I'm still trying to, I suppose, assimilate a lot of the talks. It was a little like listening to a version of Reeling in the Years, if they still show that in Ireland, where you sort of get quick snapshots of all of the sort of intellectual debates, critical debates that we've, that have spanned a career rolled into one morning. I just make a few quick points, and then I'll try to come back, I think, to where David Lloyd's talk finished, and repose the question that I think David ended on. I think it is important to register. Certainly, if I were to think back over my career and starting to work in Ireland in 1993 and coming in under the rubric of post-colonial stuff, so of course that's always, a simplifying term in some ways. I think it's very important to say that post-colonial critique was strongly resisted in Ireland from the very start. There's no need to name names, but if one wanted to, you could think of sort of leading figures in every single English department in the country, from Belfast down to Cork, where, senior academics, those often involved with recruiting and hiring and distribution of teaching and so forth, were determinedly opposed to post-colonialism. The argument at the time was that Ireland, this was in the 1990s, that Ireland was a white European country. It couldn't possibly therefore be part of the third world. And if its history had ever been colonial, it was so perhaps in the early modern period or in the 17th or 18th centuries, but certainly not thereafter. And I won't go into the reasons for those opposite, the reason why it was so determinedly opposed, but David is absolutely right. Part of it was political and part of it was intellectual. By the end of by the middle of let's say, the Celtic Tiger boom period, so sometime in the early 2000s, the argument had shifted again. And in some ways it shifted, in some ways it was simply an updated version of the earlier one, which was that now Ireland is affluent. Its middle classes were going to shop in New York and London and everywhere they could. And it was a country of migration inwards rather than migration outwards, and that post-colonialism had been, post-colonialism itself was part of a sort of, post-colonialism was simply passé. Ireland had moved on, it had become rich, it had become even further integrated into the European Union. Whatever connection it had to it, the argument then is almost that you didn't need to make an argument about post-colonialism. The only thing you needed to say about it was that it was passé. And of course, the irony of history being such was that while those who were advocating those arguments were saying that post-colonialism was passé, the Celtic Tiger was becoming passé even quicker than post-colonial studies itself. And I think, one of the points I would want to take away from this morning is the one that I think David made most forcefully, which is that there's an interesting way to think about 20th century Irish history, which would be to say that the modernist moment, now much derided, it seems, for odd reasons, that the modernist moment was a kind of aesthetic registration, not simply of the autonomy of art, that's obviously important to the history of modernism, but a huge registration of a sense of crisis of European civilization, if you want to put it in conservative terms, a sense of crisis of capitalism, a sense of crisis of the arts themselves, a very profound and quite widely encompassing sense of crisis. And one of the things that didn't happen at the time, I don't think Ireland was in a situation for this to happen, was that there were some sympathetic critical receptions of that modernist aesthetic moment, but it was largely expatriate. And the universities weren't simply, I would say, decolonized themselves enough to know remotely what to do with that kind of, with what Irish artists and writers were producing in the period. I don't sort of want to write about or to say that in too broad stroke terms, because there were people who were making sense of it, but generally speaking, Irish modernism was interpreted outside of Ireland and then interpreted in Ireland, partly thanks to post-colonial criticism itself. Post-colonial criticism, there are many ways in which you could think about it, but one way in which you could think about it would be to say that it was an attempt to take what had been an aesthetic registration of the catastrophe of capitalism and imperialism, and to find a critical vocabulary that would include Ireland, but not be exclusive to Ireland, to register the same crisis, or to register that crisis as it had deepened in some ways. So I would say there's a lot of interesting continuity to be taught, perhaps, between modernism and post-colonialism. And I guess that brings me rather to the point that I think David finished at. There's a strong sense in modernism of the catastrophe as being so all-encompassing. And it's not simply that art can register a crisis outside of itself. That crisis is within art itself, within all of the arts. And again, in our own moment, as Malcolm and others have suggested, there's a sense of the crisis being globalized, being darker and deeper than ever, and now up against a sense of a race against time. And I guess that sense of, let's say, modernist melancholia, which was so often, which you can find a version of in post-colonial criticism as well, a sense that, very constricted agency, very limited time, what can, not the writer or the critic, but what can sustain struggle in that condition. That seems to me one of the questions that David was putting very articulately, much better than I am doing, on the table. And I think it is one that I would be interested to hear what, our panelists of different generations how they would address that particular question. I do think myself, if I just can be permitted one last comment, it is that it can't simply be a pointing to social movements, important as that is. Important to modernism and important to post-colonial criticism was an intellectual engagement with the crisis as well. If you think that, intellectual stuff is just what people do in libraries or in cartels or in their, at their desks, well then, everything that we do will seem inevitably futile and insignificant.
Thank you, Enda and Joe. Michael, I'm conscious of the fact we're already out of time, so we really can only take about under 10 minutes, I imagine, more of people's time, and some people may not be able to stay. Perhaps some of our panelists may not be able to stay. I will just mention a couple of themes that have come up on the chat, but I think it's also important to get back to everybody who's spoken this afternoon, because I'm sure you'll have many responses and thoughts about each other's presentations as well. So I will just invite you to do that, but I would mention that several attendees, including Nessa, Owen, Roisin and several others, made a point about the Irish language and the underdevelopment of comparative studies, even within English and Irish, in Irish studies and in post-colonial studies. And that leads into a broader point about comparative studies. There was lots of quote unquote calls for more comparative study during the era of post-colonial studies in Ireland. Certain work was done, certain other parallels with other formerly colonized countries, especially India, were extremely important. The issue of Palestine was raised, I think, quite powerfully. But the obstacles to comparative work that Treasa spoke about, the institutional and financial obstacles to that in Irish universities remain. So I don't know if anybody is free to respond to that, but that has been a common theme in the responses. But I would like to ask everybody, maybe in the order in which you spoke, if that's possible, just if you'd like to get back to us with any quick impressions or responses to the discussion. So Treasa was up first this afternoon.
Oh no. I just want to say how clarifying Joe's comments were, partly because the history of the resistance to post-colonial studies in Ireland, like, it isn't something that I would have been thought about in my undergraduate course of study, and it does feel like I am kind of conscious of the periodicity conversations that can sometimes feel like in new generations trying to reinvent a discussion that maybe already happened. But I was kind of struck by I was reading Lynn Ennis's piece from the early 1990s and trying to write a comparative piece in post-colonial literary studies approach to South Africa and Ireland and a few other places, and being told that she couldn't write about Ireland because it wasn't a post-colonial nation state. And kind of not really knowing how to approach that. You know, I was reading it in preparation for the seminar this week, and to think of that kind of resistance. And I think certainly, I guess what I was saying was about the periodic registration of the sense that a particular kind of rhetoric or discourse, as though it was no longer in vogue, the sense that you were saying that we were, Ireland was passé and it moved beyond a certain language of coloniality, even though that coloniality needs to be retooled and thought about in relation to Ireland's engagement with capitalism. But also I often think of, you know, kind of feminist movements in Ireland around reproduction and of historical revisions as dealing with a kind of internal colonisation too, because obviously the transformation of labour conditions in Ireland from the 50s onwards and the impact that had on women especially was around the internal colonisation, the enclosure of women within a particular labour regime, right? Like cheap domestic labour, for example, or cheap reproductive kind of labour. So I kind of think the ongoing need for this kind of post-colonial, I guess, rhetoric and theorization, like, it's kind of obvious to me, but I think we need a lot more discussion, like a few others have pointed out, about decolonization. And it's not that we're post-colonial and we're decolonizing now, like, it's something else. And I think we need to keep having that discussion about how decolonization has been perceived in history, for example, and what it does for us literary critics, and what it does in terms of like an ongoing dialogue with work that's already been happening. Because again, I'm aware that we can't just keep reinventing conversations that maybe have happened before. So I'd love to hear more people speak about that. Maybe that's a topic for a different seminar.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I guess it's me next, is it, Emer?
It is.
Yeah.
David,
I mean,
yes.
I wish we had 2 hours to go on with.
Yeah, I know.
These papers were so astonishingly rich. And let me start by getting, you know, something I wanted to say by first thanking Treasa and Lionel for bringing up so forcibly the issue of race and citizenship in Ireland right now, because it struck me for a long time and stuck in my craw that there's been all this celebration of 2 referenda that make Ireland look this plucky little socially, you know, progressive island. And everybody forgets about the 27th Amendment and the 80% of the Irish population who voted basically to overturn fundamental Republican principles of birthright citizenship and to turn this place into a blood and soil nation racist state. And I think until that amendment is repealed and overturned and citizenship is granted to people not only who are born in Ireland, but who come to Ireland seeking refuge from the atrocities that our prosperity is partly perpetuating, as Malcolm so forcibly told us, Ireland will be a racial state and will have actually assumed the garb of the very kinds of states that it fought against in order to gain this putative independence. And I think that that has to be high on the social agenda of people who claim to be post-colonial critics, and you know, just the first thing that seems to need to happen. That said, I'll say quickly I think it's right to say that Ireland had a post-colonial moment intellectually, and that moment was crucial and critical. I think just, listening to Irish Times podcasts, which is not the source of the most radical thinking in Ireland right now, but it keeps me a little bit up to date with what's going on and how the establishment are thinking. They are totally happy now to talk about Ireland having been colonized. You see this over and over again, the absorption of intellectual interventions that were repudiated and hated into common parlance and their neutralization and normalization. But of course, it's said as something that is a decorative claim that Ireland can make on the world stage, but it has absolutely no force whatsoever. But I think that post-colonialism represented a very particular moment, as I tried to say at the start, which was the need to rethink the legacies of nationalism in a critical way from the perspective of nation states that had, to some extent, achieved formal independence, and then to try to understand what nationalism included. The second agenda of it was to sort of open up the space for precisely making available what was occluded to our historical consciousness as something, to go to Malcolm's citation of Arundhati Roy at the end, something whose footsteps are constantly traceable, if not audible. But the idea is not to try to represent that, to go back to Enda's thing. It's not about representation. I think it's more about opening spaces by critiquing the formations of the state that have taken place, which tend to be homogenizing, and to work instead, I'm looking at Colleen Parsons' question in the chat, not to think so much of comparison and to say, oh, Ireland is like other post-colonial states and so forth, but to think of it in terms of differentiation. And I'm very struck by the ways in which colonized cultures that I've been in conversation with, whether the Philippines or Palestine and so forth, on the one hand, recognize Ireland as having been colonized immediately, without any doubt whatsoever, and have learnt from Irish practices. And I have to say, we haven't been less good at learning from their practices much of the time. But they also, have been through this homogenizing process of imperialism, but on the other hand, have produced different modes of alternative to it and antagonism to it. And that sense of the differential site of the anti-colonial is very important to me. It's not that we compare, it's that we understand how local conditions in face of a homogenizing machine of colonial capitalism produce difference and different modes of resistance, from which in turn we can learn, as the Palestinians learned to resist the black and tans who were sent there after they'd been trained here. So I could go on, but I think we need to be embracing, first of all, what Lionel's volume pioneered, a settler colonial paradigm, because I think, and I've written about this, that settler colonial tactics and mentalities are very much being integrated into the neoliberal laboratories of the moment, and Israel and Northern Ireland have been two of those. And I think that sense of a decolonial project informed yet again by the settler colonial analysis that the displacement of Fanon and Memmi and Cabral and others kind of instituted in the advent of post-colonial studies. It's really important. And that brings with it, of course, a very strong sense of race as a central aspect of imperialism that post-colonialism, in a certain sense, in its history and in its foci, displaced and marginalized from the thinking of colonialism. Anyway, sorry, I'll shut up there. There's so much else I want to respond to, but that's what I can do.
Caoilfhionn?
Yeah, I'm still kind of processing a lot of the conversations that we've listened to. And I suppose what has struck me, and it kind of strikes me when I've attended a lot of these kind of virtual seminars in other jurisdictions, because I think in some ways, I was in some ways space and, you know, not just temporality, but, you know, our spatial geography matters. And you know, one of the things that struck me listening to an interview with Catherine Corliss as she talked about undergoing her research on the Tuam site, and she said, you know, it's a long way from Tuam to Dublin. And I thought, you know, there is this kind of, I think, this difference in how we understand these kind of geographies. And the kind of discussions that happen. But I do think in ways that the discussion has got very stuck in Ireland in different ways. And I think, you know, some of the points that were raised, you know, like what I think that point that David just made about the referendum around race and citizenship, and you know, we kind of have these blockages. I suppose this is where I find the frustration around the kind of conversations at the moment, be it in the Irish Times or in these kind of history seminars, that we can't seem to move beyond almost this kind of revisionist paradigm or a hibernocentric kind of paradigm, when in fact the kind of crises we're facing is you know, so much more extensive. And I kind of see as well, you know, this kind of carceral network where we have, you know, direct provision in the way we had, you know, the rounding up of kind of Republicans in the 30s and 40s, and that, you know, and I'm not collapsing kind of that these are very different and distinct kind of contexts, but you see, I just think that at the moment, I suppose, not to be too despairing about it, but I think we are kind of, I suppose, firstly, this conversation is so important in different ways because we do need that kind of theoretical, I suppose, post-colonial theoretical understanding to really start this process of understanding everything like Ireland's situation within a broader framework, but also the, you know, the challenges of you know, so many displaced peoples in the world. I mean, I was very struck by Malcolm's, that last image of the people at the border, and you know, I suppose the ecological crisis, and so you know, that we just seem to have, and yet the conversations around empire are so stuck at the moment that I would just call or kind of really look for, I suppose, a broader conversation again.
Thank you, Caoilfhionn. We would hope maybe to facilitate some further conversations down the line, possibly in real life. But it's certainly great to begin this in this format at least. Lionel and then Malcolm, which I'm afraid will have to represent a conclusion just because of the time being so short.
Well, here's a gift to you all. I've almost nothing to say except to thank both some of the panelists and the people who responded, which was very, very clarifying. I mean, there was such a diversity of papers, but no, I've nothing to say other than just repeat things that I said earlier. And but thank you all very much. I think pass on to Malcolm.
Okay, and I'll be short too, Emer. Yeah, similarly, lots of thoughts in my head, so I'll be very quick. I think responding to this kind of global biopolitics, you know, across the Westphalian logic, my comment would be that we actually already have a global biopolitics, which is called neoliberal capitalism, right? And of course, like, you know, it's the old idea of Jemson's, right? We can imagine the end of the world, but we can't imagine the end of capitalism. And I think that might kind of have to play out in an alternative form of planetarity, right, versus globalism. I also kind of fully agree with this importance of citizenship. I think the so-called battle for climate change is playing out in the international courts of justice, right? Beyond capital, it's playing out on who has sovereignty, who has statehood, who has citizenship, and who has not. And I think the depoliticized afterlife of ecology and environmentalism in Ireland needs to engage with, you know, in your words, like the post-colonial toolkit to actually kind of, again, reinvigorate what essentially can often be very quickly depoliticized, right? But those are my initial thoughts, and I'm going to stop there.
Okay. I just want to very briefly thank again our panelists, Treasa, David, Caoilfhionn, Lionel and Malcolm for their contributions this afternoon, and also to those who responded to them, Michael, Enda and Joe, who have given so generously of their time to this project of talking things through in this extraordinary spring semester of 2021. Thank you most sincerely for your patience, and also to our very many attendees who have stayed in this discussion for so long. Details of future events will be available on the English Department webpage, and the recording of this event will be posted as well quite soon. So thanks again, and good afternoon, or some of you are coming into the afternoon, you've stayed with us so long. So good evening and thanks.